Because my hobby is documenting the libraries of video game consoles, I spend a lot of time going through old Japanese game magazines. And every once in a while, I come across something unusual in them. Sometimes it's weird comic strips, or instructions on how to modify your game console with a soldering iron, or an evolutionary chart of Japanese RPGs when the whole genre was only 5 years old at that point. And then sometimes these game magazines get really weird, especially the ones that were struggling. Currently I'm going through every game released for the PC Engine, and in 1989, as the platform was just starting to take off, suddenly there were 3 PC Engine magazines on the market in Japan. Icon PC Engine was the de facto official PC Engine magazine. PC Engine Fan was the plucky upstart. Not as popular, but had a big publisher behind it, and so it wound up running until the end of the system's life. And then there's Marukatsu PC Engine. And the best thing I can say about them is, well, they tried. Marukatsu PC Engine tried some odd things to boost their sales, and the oddest might have been the first. Starting in their first issue, January 1989, they ran an RPG for readers of their magazine. Not an RPG that you play on the PC Engine, an RPG that you played with the magazine. This RPG ran for 9 issues, up through October of 1989, and as I was going through the magazines, I started thinking, is it possible to make this playable for somebody in 2025? Could the concept of this game that was played once, 36 years ago, be saved? And I think it can. I can't make it exactly the same. There are details that were behind the scenes that are lost, and I'm not going to break this out across 9 videos, just like the RPG was broken across 9 months. But I think I can give you something pretty close to the experience. And so I'm inviting you to play a game that has been lost for 35 years. An RPG in a style that is long dead. I'll be your game master as we play The Lord of the Crystal. Before I start getting into how you, yes you, will be able to play, it will help to have a little bit of background. Pen and paper role-playing games were a late arrival in Japan. Dungeons & Dragons was almost 10 years old before there was an official translation. But as the 80s progressed, they started getting a little bit more traction. A lot of that is credited to printing the sessions of a Dungeons & Dragons campaign in some computer game magazines. And those sessions would become the novel series Record of Lodos War. In these days when other players were few and far between, one way that people played was mail-in RPGs. These took a few different forms, but the ones that are relevant here involve players getting a record of what happened in the previous session, and then replying to that with a postcard where they chose what their characters would be doing. The Game Master would receive those postcards, try to integrate everything into a new portion of the story, and then send out an update. The largest of these mail-in RPGs could have hundreds of players and go on for years. As far as I can tell, Lord of the Crystal is the first of these mail-in RPGs to be played through a video game magazine, though it won't be the last. If you've watched my videos detailing every game in the Famicom library, you might recall Double Moon Densetsu, one of the very last RPGs on the Famicom, and it was a video game that acted as the bridge between 2 different mail-in RPGs. Now, for most of those mail-in games, players didn't just get to write down whatever they wanted. They got a menu of options, selected from them, and then received a score based on how they did. And that's the way that Lord of the Crystal works. You'll make a character, then I'll give you some information that bridges the next part of the story, and then a set of options. You'll pick what you want to do, and then we go on. Now, one vital step that we're going to be skipping is that you're not going to be mailing your decisions to me and then I resolve them. Instead, after I get through the next story section, I'll tell you how you can resolve your selections. You might get some score based on that, and then you'll tally up your score. In Lord of the Crystal, the final winner had a score of nearly 3,000, but dividing up the math that fine would make it unpleasant. There were also prizes for the highest scores in Lord of the Crystal. There were things like RPG source books, sketches by the artist, and of course, Marukatsu PC Engine paraphernalia. Look at that nice pen you could get. The scenario for Lord of the Crystal was created by Masaya Koizumi, who was one of the staffers at Marukatsu PC Engine. The art was by Hirofumi Nakamura, who is mainly known for his fantasy and RPG illustrations. And the game design is by Yuen Tai. And you might think that's a strange name for a person, and that's because it's not a person. Yuen Tai was the name of an RPG publisher in Japan, and they released the very first pen and paper RPG in Japan, The Roads to the Lord, or Roads to Lord, because they wrote the words "the" very tiny. The setting of Lord of the Crystal is from Roads to Lord, though that's not actually mentioned anywhere in Lord of the Crystal. If you're curious about what kind of RPG Roads to Lord was, it was basically a copy of Rollmaster, a system where you had a list of skills rated on percentages, and then you had to roll that percentage. It's possible that Lord of the Crystal used such a system behind the scenes, but we're not going to bother with that. This is going to be complicated enough as it is. Okay, let's actually get into making a character. If you're going to play along with this video, you're going to have a character sheet. You can do it on paper, you could open up an Excel spreadsheet, whatever is convenient for you. Here's a spreadsheet I created for tracking a character. And as you can see, there really isn't that much to keep track of for your character's abilities. What you'll really need to track is your stamina, which will go down as you take actions, and up as you rest or have certain events occur. And you'll want to have some space to take notes, because the actions you take will modify what happens with future actions. Now, the very first thing you need to do is give your character a name. In the mail-in version of Lord of the Crystal, this was visible to everyone, and you had to create a personal identification number to go along with it, but we're going to skip that step. Next, your character needs a race. The most significant thing that race will affect are interactions with other characters. Humans getting along with other humans, that kind of thing. As in most RPGs of the era, humans are the default. They're the most widespread of the groups, and known for having strong will. Elves are also called fairies in this setting, though they also have tiny winged fairies in one chapter. Elves are eternally young, do magic, are known for being pretty, and are taller than humans. So, standard fantasy elves. And of course, that carries over to the dwarves. They're short, bearded, live in the mountains, enjoy mining, are skilled blacksmiths. It's exactly what you'd expect. And then there are the halflings, who are even shorter than dwarves. Halflings live in holes in the ground, not nasty, dirty, wet holes filled with the ends of worms and an oozy smell, nor yet a dry, bare, sandy hole with nothing in it to sit down on or to eat. They live in halfling holes, and that means comfort. Halflings are agile, and definitely not just because they're burglars. Plus, they recover an extra stamina point any time stamina recovery occurs. And finally, there's the goblins, or demons. They're known for being selfish and cowardly. You really feel the 80s RPG on this one. Next, you select which god you worship. They all have funky fantasy names, but also are associated with a color, so if you're playing along, write down the color. That's how I'm going to display it on the screen, at least. First up is Evo the White. This god favors peace and stability, and sometimes offers prophecies. Evo's counterpart is Duel the Black. Duel is the nominal villain of Lord of the Crystal, but it's because he's the god of accelerationism. He's pro-change and conflict, and in Lord of the Crystal his end goal is to improve the world by breaking everything first. Ozan the Gold is the god of the sun, life, and light. They seem to have something to do with magic as well. Owl the Blue is the god of the sea, law, and order. Yes, that does make him overlap with Evo the White. Zari the Purple governs knowledge and communications. A guy who knows everything that's going on. Valpani the Red governs war, power, authority, and the mountains. They're also a patron of the dwarves. Finally, there's Medito the Green, god of spirit, instinct, and the moon. This god is the patron of the elves. Pick one of those gods out, write down the color on your character sheet, and then you need to pick out a class. There's warriors, who start with a stamina of 6 instead of 5 like everyone else does. And of course, they're going to be good at any fighting-related tasks. Then there are wizards, and of course they can cast spells, do mystical things, know the secrets of the world. Priests have a deeper connection to the gods than other classes, and as such, they double the influence that a god has on an event. Or to put it another way, all of the gods are going to have modifiers for events. If you're a priest, you double whatever the modifier is. Bards travel the land, and as such are in tune with world events. Merchants have to get along with everyone, and they're good at acquiring supplies when necessary. And then there are crafters, who might be able to make whatever you need. Write down your class, and then for your starting stamina, it's 5 for all classes except warriors, and warriors start with 6. That's also the maximum value that you can have. So keep that in mind as you play. You'll need to pick a number between 1 and 10 as your lucky number. This number will give you either a bonus or penalty when it comes to resolving your decisions. Essentially, I'll roll a 10-sided die, and if you're close to the number that I rolled, you'll get a bonus. And of course, I'm looping 10 and 1 together. If you're far away from the number, you'll get a penalty. When the time comes, I'll put a chart on the screen so you can see exactly what to add or subtract. For your number, just pick anything 1 to 10. As I'm recording this, I haven't even rolled any dice yet, so I don't know what number will be good. Now it's time to get into the prologue, which doesn't have any decisions for you to make, but it will let you know what's going on. For all of these chapters, I'm just going to do a summary, and that's because it's really poorly written. It's the kind of fantasy writing where it's a bunch of people sitting around telling you that an event occurred. I think it's 6 chapters in before there's any kind of actual action in a scene. On top of that, there's some weird gaps, and a lot of the chapters are dedicated to referencing players. Just rattling off a dozen names so that somebody can go, oh, there's my character. Yeah, so I'm skipping all of that. Hundreds of years ago, there was an enormous war between humans and elves. The elves lost pretty badly, and they retreated into their vast forest, casting a spell over it so that no one unwelcome could enter it. As a result of this war, the goblins were isolated into barren lands in the northwest of the continent, the dwarves withdrew to their mountain halls, and humans basically ruled everywhere. The god Duel the Black instigated the previous war, and is especially unhappy about this outcome, since he wants all of the people living together. To that end, he initiates a new plan. Duel implants the seeds of ambitions into Prince Gazal Dior. The prince is half human, half elf, and for that reason his father the king disinherited him. Gazal Dior rebels, and the conflict ends in a duel between father and son in the throne room of the Kingdom of Horizon. But there's a catch. The Throne of Horizon has a property where it rejects all unworthy rulers. It's a place of great power, and the blood shed in that room split history into 2 paths. In one, Gazal Dior rules the country of Horizon and is making preparations. Down the other leg of the trousers of time, the king has abdicated, but Gazal Dior has vanished. No one sits on the throne of Horizon, and no one is quite sure what can happen next. In the original version of Lord of the Crystal, this timeline split was to allow for 2 groups of players. Characters would only exist in one timeline, and so they'd play every other month. Well, that's awfully confusing. For the purposes of our game, you've got one character who's in both timelines, and their actions are closely linked enough that any effects carry between them. What I'm saying is, the split timeline matters for the plot. You'll want to take it into account when you're making your choices, but you're only playing one character. Now for a quick geography lesson, since some of this geography is going to matter. Horizon is the kingdom on the eastern side of the continent. The massive lakes that act as their borders are packed with water dragons. The dragons will attack anyone who attempts to cross the water who hasn't been authorized. Stratium is the kingdom in the southwest corner of the continent, though it's a disorganized kingdom. It's governed by a confederation of principalities. It's the most powerful of the human nations. Elda is the kingdom of the elves, located entirely within this forest. However, other elves can be found in Ryla, the frozen waste in the center north of the continent. This is where the elves who sided with Duel the Black in the Great War hid once everything was over. In the northwest of the continent is Dura, the Goblin Kingdom, which occasionally sends out an invasion force to try to take more territory. Bordering them are the Duron Mountains. That's where the Dwarven Kingdom lies, and that puts the goblins and dwarves in constant conflict. The wide grasslands of Ramzas form the center of the continent. Here you'll find many nomadic tribesmen. Of the southern shore is Huno, a volcanic island known to be a haven for pirates. Finally, in the center of the continent lies the former capital of the world, Endarnum. The city was destroyed during the war, and now the vast ruins are home to demons and ghosts. That's the world and the backstory. Now we'll get into the story, where you'll actually have to make some choices. Our story begins on the island of Helia, which lies in a lake on the border of Horizon. Mysterious events have been occurring across the world, and so the great sage Ilfar Magnus has invited all of the wisest people to join him for a council. This is the timeline where Gazar Dior took the throne, and since then strange weather, unnatural occurrences, and evil tidings can be found everywhere. There's great concern that the throne has failed, that it didn't reject Gazar Dior, and Horizon now has a disastrous ruler. One by one, people in the symposium come up and describe what is happening in their region. On the west coast of the continent in Orem, there has been a massive fish die-off. And on their northern border with Dura, kingdom of the goblins, an unnatural winter has taken hold. Stratium in the southwest has also experienced thousands of dead fish washing ashore, and the pirates of Huno have become especially active. In the Ramzas grasslands, a mysterious shimmering zone has appeared. It looks similar to the effects of heat, but it's the middle of winter. Just south of Ramzas, the forest of Nahan is rapidly dying. In Old Endarnum, the shadows are moving, and the land has become dangerous to traverse. Horizon's harvests have failed. King Gazar Dior is building an army, and demons have been spotted throughout the land. At this point, the sages notice an uninvited guest at their council. The legendary thief Marl McMarl is hanging out in the rafters. The guards catch him and bring him before Ilfar Magnus, where Marl reveals what happened in the throne room, and Marl knows that the timeline has split. Ilfar ponders if it's time for Rudolfarn's miracle, something that a lot of people seem to know the name of, but not what it actually is. Marl slips away and heads to a nearby city, where he tells everybody what happened at the council, and everyone with an adventurous spirit decides to set out and confront the danger to the world. Okay, it's decision time. Here's the way this works. I have a list of 9 options, and you're going to choose to do 3 of them. The order that you choose to do these in is important. These tasks are spread across the entire continent, and dashing from one side to the other will make it less likely for you to succeed. There's also a 10th task, 0. You choose to not do anything and just rest and recover your stamina. Anytime that we resolve an action, you will subtract at least 1 stamina, possibly more depending on how things go. If you run out of stamina, then you just don't take the action that you wrote down in that spot. You'll rest instead. When you rest, you recover 3 stamina, except for halflings who recover 4. Managing your stamina is the big resource for the game, and as we progress, you'll have to trade off taking an action for points with having enough stamina to do something later. Here's your options this time. Number 1. Go to Oron and figure out why the fish have died off. Number 2. Go to Oron and investigate the unnatural winter. Number 3. Go to Stradium and investigate the fish problem there. Number 4. Go to Stradium and take care of the pirates. Number 5. Go to Ramzas and see what you can find out about that shimmering zone. Number 6. Go to the Forest of Nahan and figure out what's killing it. Number 7. Investigate what's happening around Endarnum. Number 8. Go to Pharaohnome, capital of Horizon, and find out what happened in that throne room. Number 9. Remain in Helia and try to figure out what Rudolfarn's miracle is. These are your choices. Pick 3 actions that you'll take, write them down in the order that you want to take them, and lock in your answers now. Ready to resolve those? Well, sorry, you're going to have to wait. Results were posted in Marukatsu PC Engine 2 months later, and the options for you in the alternate chapters often have some knowledge overlap, so we won't resolve any of these Chapter 1 choices until I reach Chapter 3. If you've written down your answers, I'll move on to Chapter 2. Now you might have noticed that the previous king, the father of Mad Prince Ghazal Dior, doesn't have a name. Well, they must have gotten some letters about it, because in the introduction to this chapter, the storyteller who appears in the introduction segments says that nobody remembers who that king was. And then, just in the middle of the chapter, they give him a name anyways. It's Lilian, by the way. The story of Chapter 2 takes place in the Doran Mountains, where Donres, an immortal and ancient dwarf, is visiting King Namaris. Donres is bringing tidings of the unusual events that have occurred since King Lilian abdicated and Prince Ghazal Dior vanished. Yet we're in the other timeline for this one. The demons have become active again and are planning to attack. A mysterious continent-spanning cloud forms a snake-like ribbon in the sky. A strange shimmering zone has appeared in the Ramzas grasslands. The conversation is interrupted because the guards have caught a thief breaking into the king's vault. And of course that thief turns out to be Marl McMarl. Marl's brought before the 2 dwarves, where he's just so gosh darn likable the king sends the guards away. Marl then lets Donres know that the timeline has split, and that if it isn't repaired, then the world will end. Marl is looking for crystal artifacts called Lara Renan's Tears. One of these crystals has made Donres immortal. With that information imparted, Marl slips away, and this is something that he's been doing all over the continent, dropping hints to people about the peril the world is in, and then vanishing again just as quickly. And as a result, adventurers everywhere are looking into things. Okay, so that's what you have to go on. It's time to make your decisions. Once again, you'll be making 3 choices from this list, and the order that you select them in matters. If you took 3 actions in the first chapter, you'll probably be too tired to take 3 actions this time. And so don't forget that you can always pick option 0 as a rest, and then recover 3 stamina, or 4 if you're a halfling. Here are your options for Chapter 2. You may choose to investigate the Dwarven Kingdom. See if you can find out anything unusual happening there. You can choose to join the forces and fight the demonic invaders. And by demonic, I mean goblins. Option 3 is to investigate the immortal dwarf Donres. What's he know? Does he have anything going on? Option 4 is to follow the mysterious snake-like cloud. That's the one that stretches across the entire sky. For option 5, you can go to Horizon and see if you can find out anything about the magical throne there, no longer allowing King Lillian to sit on it. Option 6 is to go to the Ramzaz grasslands and try to figure out what's happening in that shimmering zone. Option 7 is to find information on Lararanon's tears. What are they, anyways? Option 8 is to go to the city of London, where Marl was last seen, and try to pick up his trail there. And finally, option 9 is to try to steal Lararanon's tear from Donres, the crystal that grants him immortality. There are your 9 options. Pick 3 to do. Remember, the order matters. Write them down, and we'll find out what happened when we reach Chapter 4. And now it's time to resolve your decisions from Chapter 1. How this is going to work is that every decision is going to have a chart on screen, and you'll need to add up your bonuses and penalties for your race, class, god, lucky number, and sometimes a few bonus effects. And if you're greater than or equal to the challenge number for the task, then it's a success. You get whatever reward was marked down for that task. It'll be a certain number of points, and in some cases, you'll get some additional thing that will affect other tasks. You might get to add one more to your next task result, or get some free stamina recovery, things like that. Similarly, failing a task might incur a penalty. After we resolve a task, subtract 1 point from your stamina, and if something happens where you're out of stamina, but you've still marked further tasks down to resolve for this chapter, then your next task automatically becomes a rest task, so you'll change it to 0. And when we resolve that one, rather than losing stamina, you'll gain 3, except for halflings who gain 4. One more important rule to keep in mind here is that since I'm not really sitting there with you, I can't smooth over any situations that you run into. So while I tried to keep this simple, if you find yourself confused, just handle things the way it makes sense to you. The most you're going to get out of this are bragging rights, so relax, and if you run into trouble, don't overthink it. I'm going to go through the list of possible actions in order, but you'll need to resolve yours in the order that you wrote them down. So you might have to jump back and forth in this section of the video if you're playing along. At the end of my explanations for each task, there will be a short section where I will put all of the cards back up on screen for a few seconds each. So you might find it easier to look through them then. I'm also going to go into a lot more detail for this first set of resolutions, just to help you understand and make it easier once we get to the later chapters. So here we go. Option 1, investigate the fish dying in Oron. You have to get a total of 2 or better to understand what's happening. That makes it a relatively easy task. For racial bonuses, humans, halflings, and goblins either live in the area or are likely to encounter plenty of fishing, and so they have a small bonus. Elves and dwarves, on the other hand, are mainly confined to their own regions away from the sea, and so have a small penalty. Next up is which god you worship. Owl the Blue governs the sea, so if you worship him, you're probably going to get a pretty good idea of what's happening. On the other hand, fish don't know anything about war or authority, so Galpani the Red has no clue what's going on. And the other gods either touch on this slightly, or it's just not their thing. Remember that if you're a priest, then you double this effect, including the negative penalty if you're a priest of Galpani the Red. For the effect of your class, a bunch of fish washing up on shore isn't really a warriors or wizards thing. On the other hand, merchants might be aware of problems with fishing, and those craftsmen building boats, sewing nets, and doing all of the other tasks necessary are going to be a lot closer to the subject. For the lucky number, I rolled 1. So find your lucky number in that top row and see if there's a bonus or penalty being applied for it. For the other modifiers, these are associated with where you're coming from. If you were just doing tasks 8 or 9, then you had to cross the entire continent to get here, and you're going to be tired out and less effective. Similarly, number 7 comes from pretty far away. But then task number 2 also takes place in Oron, so you might have picked up some additional information that can help you with this one. Okay, total everything up, and if the result is 2 or better, then give yourself 5 points. And I mean that literally, give yourself 5 points, because that's how we're scoring this game. If you didn't get over 3, well, no big deal. You just found out how much dead fish stink, and nothing else really happened. Okay, that's 1 down. You got an idea of how it works? We're going to start speeding up now. Option 2 is to investigate the early winter in Oron. The target number is 3 because conditions are a bit more hazardous for this one. Goblins get the big benefit because it's happening right on their border, and there isn't a god that really strongly resonates with this one. In this situation, bards and merchants are going to have a little bit more insight, and the luckiest number this time is 8. For other modifiers, it's still all about running from one side of the continent to the other, and if you manage to get 3 or above, then you get 5 points. Well, if you attempt this task and can't do it, you're losing 1 extra stamina, so 2 for doing this task. That's because you're running around in the freezing cold for weeks trying to figure out where winter came from. Don't forget you can pause these screens if you need to look at the resolution chart for a little while longer. Your third option was to investigate the fish dying in Stradium, and hey, we just saw this. There's no new or outside factors here, so the chart is almost entirely the same, except for the modifiers where now you get a bonus if you did number 4 right before this. Oron and Stradium are right next to each other on the map, so you're not wearing yourself out traveling between the two of them, but being in the same location will give you that bonus. Even the lucky number was pretty close. And just as before, if you passed, you get 5 points. If you didn't, well, no real harm done. Okay, action junkies. Task 4 was to stop the pirates in Stradium, and now your target number is 4. As we all know from our Tolkien, dwarves and halflings aren't very good with boats, so they get -1. Gods who like you beating things up or know about the ocean are going to give you bonuses, and the rest aren't going to be much help. And the adventurer classes are going to do well at this one. Fighting pirates is the warrior's jam. Task 4's lucky number is 4. And the modifiers are still all about what you did before this. Fighting pirates is high risk, high reward. So you get 10 points if you manage to beat them. Plus, you've stolen one of their ships. So for the rest of this chapter, if a task gives you a penalty for doing tasks 3 or 4 before it, just ignore that. On the other hand, if you didn't succeed, well then you've been captured by pirates, and you're going to be held captive for your next action. If this wasn't your last action for this chapter, just scratch out whatever's next. You're spending that time escaping, so you don't even get to rest and recover stamina. Option 5 was to investigate the Shimmering Zone in the Ramzas grassland. If you chose to do this one, congratulations, you found the one that is part of the plot. Most of the bonuses here tie into the plot of the story, and if this is the final task you are doing in this chapter, then you get a bit of a bonus. Because this is the plot-relevant task, it scores the most points, which is actually how it worked in the original game. And there are forces at work that will prevent you from getting into any serious trouble if you screw up here, so there's no penalty for failure. Option 6 was to find out what's killing the forests of Nahan, and this is another easier task. Anyone who's capable of handling themselves in the woods gets a bonus, and the only real negative penalty is if you had to cross 2/3 of the continent to get here. For a simple task, there's only 5 points for success, and you're not really risking anything when you fail. Number 7 was looking into the events around Endarnum, and this is one that can be a bit of a challenge, but if you can do it, it's worth a lot of points. It's a task that rewarded stealthier approaches more than anything else. If you manage to succeed, well, the feat you pulled off is so great, you can add one to your next task, even if it's on the next chapter. If you fail, however, well then you had to run away from some black riders, and lose some extra stamina. Task 8 was to go to Faronome and find out what exactly happened in the throne room when King Lilian fought Prince Ghazal Dior. Now, this task is extremely difficult, since the people who know aren't really going to want to talk about it. And the Kingdom of Horizon isn't exactly the best place for a lot of people these days. If you succeed at this, you'll get 15 points, and secret knowledge that might come in handy at some point. If you fail, well then you are just some person asking questions. The ninth and final option you could have selected was to seek information on Rudolfarn's miracle. A bit of a difficult task because the information is secret, but it's not impossible if your character's good at gathering information. And there you go. That's how we resolve all 9 tasks for Chapter 1. I'm going to put the 9 task resolution slides up on the screen again for a few seconds each to help you flip back and forth if you need to. Chapter 3 kicks off with a parade of player characters. I'm not going to rattle all of them off, but there are some fun name choices here. In Ramzas, the elf Alpha Allen encounters the priest Filsral Idiot. Alpha Allen had investigated the weather in Oron and found that while it was unusual, it wasn't mystical in nature. The two know that Marl McMarl is somewhere in Ramzas, and King Ghazal Dior, because we're in that timeline, has sent people to Ramzas to try to buy horses for his army. Meanwhile, in the forest of Nahan, a pair of elven wizards have determined that the cause for the withering of the trees was somewhere else, and so they depart to investigate the Shimmering Zone. It also turns out that the fish dying off was a natural phenomenon. On the plains of Ramzas, they encounter an elven woman riding a unicorn, Queen Ramili Nafaran. They try to enlist her aid, explaining how Ghazal Dior has taken over Horizon, and that the timeline is now split and has to be repaired. But Ramili Nafaran has sworn never to leave the plains, and so she is unable to help. While discussing this, the Shimmering Zone approaches them. As they're observing it, the group is approached by 2 dwarves, Carnicle Thyson and Georgia Scar, and the dwarves have captured the goblin Rastan. The 3 had just come from Endarnum, where they observed winged demons but couldn't get into the city. At this point, Marl McMarl emerges from the Shimmering Zone. He explains that the Shimmering is the link between the 2 timelines, but no one is able to cross it except him. Marl convinces the dwarves to let Rastan go because he's a good goblin, and he tells the elven wizards that they need to go meet Queen Limeral Lennon. Decision time! Now they have an idea of how this works, the training wheels are off. As before, there are 9 options, and a 10th option to rest and recover stamina. Here are your 9 adventuring choices. Number 1. You can try to prevent Ghazal Dior from buying horses for his army. Number 2. If you think this Ghazal Dior guy has some good ideas, you can try to join the Horizon army as a mercenary. Number 3. You could go to the Ramzas grasslands and try to meet Ramili Nafaran yourself. He shall let you pet her unicorn. Number 4. You can try to find out why Ramili Nafaran refuses to leave the grasslands. Number 5. You can go to Endarnum and try to find out what the demons are up to. Number 6. That Shimmering Zone looks pretty cool. You could always just go through it yourself. Number 7. You can find out who that elf queen Limera Lennon is. Number 8. You could go try to meet Queen Limera Lennon yourself. And number 9. That Marl McMarl's kind of weird, right? You could try to find something out about him. So there you go. Here are your choices. Write down 3. And remember that the order matters. And with that, it's time to resolve your choices from Chapter 2. And don't forget the stamina rules here. Your stamina decreases by 1 after resolving one of the adventures. Taking a rest action will restore 3 stamina, unless you're a halfling, in which case you get 4. And if you run out of stamina, then you have to take a rest action, regardless of what action you have up next. And don't forget that you need to resolve your actions in order. So if you picked actions 3, 1, 8, then resolve action 3, then action 1, and finally action 8. Okay, let's hit your choices for Chapter 2. Option 1 was to investigate the Dwarven Kingdom at Duron, and this was a trivially easy task that if you had anything that granted you an advantage, you probably completed it. Of course, if you did investigate, then all you found out was that there's nothing weird happening there. So you get some token points for completing the task, and then nothing else. Option 2 was to fight the invading goblin army at Duron. If your character was good at combat and didn't run the entire way across the continent to get here, then you've got a pretty good chance of completing this one. But these guys are a sideshow, so they're not worth that many points. And if you don't succeed at this task, then lose another point of stamina for getting wounded in the fighting. Option 3 was to find information on the immortal dwarf Donres. This is a task where you're looking into an important figure and no one's really opposing you, so it's not especially difficult. And if you've already completed Task 1 in this chapter, investigating the Dwarven Kingdom, then you've already got some contacts and that gives you a small modifier. The reward, however, is very small, because any information you turn up isn't relevant to our story. Option 4 was to investigate the snake-like cloud that is spread across the continent, and no one successfully completed this task in the original game, though the Game Master's notes say that bards should have had an easier time of it. So to replicate that here, it's a relatively high target number, and you have to have some particular bonuses to succeed. Also, success in this task can be helped if you've successfully completed some other story-relevant tasks. So if you've already looked into the King in Horizon, found out about the Shimmering Zone, or tracked down Marl McMarl, then you get some additional advantages here. Successfully completing it scores 20 points because this one's story-relevant, but there's no real threat, so nothing happens if you can't complete it. Number 5 was to go to Horizon and find out why the throne had rejected King Lilian. Horizon's not as rough of place in this timeline, so this task was just about gathering rumors. The only real penalty risk is if you're running from the far side of the continent to check it out. 15 points for success because you're working to uncover the main plot, and no penalty for failure. Option 6 was to investigate the Shimmering Zone in the Ramsas grasslands, and this is identical to the choice from Chapter 1, though the lucky number has been re-rolled here. This is the key plot driver at the moment, so it's worth the most points. Option 7 was to try to gather more information on Lara Renan's tears, the crystal artifacts. And you might have noticed that the task design in this game is not especially well balanced, considering that almost every task in this chapter was all about gathering information. In this case, it's all about looking up a particular legend, and so if you've got connections to it, then you get some bonuses, and if you don't, then just nothing happens. No one successfully completed this task in the original game as well, which is why the difficulty is so high. Option 8 is to go to Ladan and search for Marl McMarl, since he is the guy who seems to know what's going on, so if you manage to find him, then you get a big bonus to the completion of your next task. If you've successfully checked out the Shimmering Zone, regardless if you did it in Chapter 1 or in this chapter, then you're getting a bit of a bonus to help you. The ninth option was to steal Lara Renan's tear from Donres, the crystal that makes him immortal. And this one is an auto-fail. Donres is personally protected by the gods, and you're not allowed to touch his crystal. So if you chose this task, then if you still have remaining tasks to do in Chapter 2, your next task is automatically switched to number 2, fighting the goblin army, because you've been conscripted into a prisoner regiment. And for your convenient reference, here's all of those resolution cards once again. Alright, time for Chapter 4. It starts with two player characters walking the King's Road, Carol Byrne and Thirst Gala. They've been trying to track down Marl McMarl, and conveniently, Marl appears right then before them. Carol Byrne is a merchant, and Marl wants her to acquire supplies for a trip to the Siri Mountains in the far north. As they head into the Ramsas grasslands, the group meets up with a lot of other characters, where they learn that a troop of human warriors help protect the Dwarven kingdoms, that the immortal dwarf Donres has a different mission than the current world split crisis, and so won't be involved in the rest of the story. Marl is trying to track down Gazal-Dur, as the prince vanished after the duel in the throne room in this timeline. Marl has learned that Gazal-Dur's mother is Queen Lemeralenin, ruler of the elves who sided with Duel the Black in the last Great War. While crossing the grasslands, the group encounters Ramili Nefarin, the unicorn-riding elf, and Marl guilts her into leaving the plains despite her oath to visit Queen Lemeralenin, because Ramili Nefarin is partially responsible for what has happened. That's when the Shimmering Zone appears, and Marl walks into it and vanishes. He reappears the next morning, and then Ramili Nefarin teleports the entire group to the frozen wastes of the north. The story gets its first action scene, as there is one sentence in which it says that they fought wolves. Arriving at the Siri Mountains, the group is told that no mortals can enter the Elven Palace, as the sorrows there extend far past their lifespan. The elves of the group go into the Ice Castle, and the only being that they encounter is Queen Lemeralenin herself, sitting on a frozen throne. It turns out that Ramili Nefarin is her sister, and Lemeralenin had the Lararanen tears, but they've recently vanished. Lemeralenin was convinced to go along with Duel's plans because she also wanted to bring the people back together, which is why she seduced King Lilian and had Gazal-Dur. Gazal-Dur had been at the Ice Palace, but departed shortly before this group arrived, right around the time that the tears vanished. The elven emissaries return to Marl to let him know what's going on, and as they depart the Ice Palace, a blizzard comes up, burying the whole structure in snow forever. Okay, it's decision time. You should be used to this by now. Here are the 9 adventure options you can pick, so write down 3 of these in the order that you're going to perform them. Number 1, you can enter the Shimmering Zone to try to cross between worlds. Number 2, that snake-like cloud crossing the continent is still there. You could check out what's going on with it. Number 3, you could head to Ramsas Grasslands, try to meet up with Ramili Nefarin, and ask her what's going on with Lauraranan's tears. Number 4, you could head to the far north and try to meet with Queen Lemeralenin. Number 5, you can try to track down Gazal-Dur in the city of Ramsas, which lies on the edge of the grasslands. Or number 6, you could try to track down Gazal-Dur in the city of Nahan. There's also number 7, you could try to track down Gazal-Dur in the great forest of Elda, the kingdom of the elves. Number 8, you could try to track down Gazal-Dur in the goblin kingdom of Dura. Or number 9, you could try to track down Gazal-Dur in Faranom, the capital city of Farizon. Yeah, it kind of feels like they ran out of ideas for these selections. Write down the 3 tasks you've chosen to do for Chapter 4, and obviously the order is extremely important for this one, and then it's time to resolve your Chapter 3 selections. Number 1 was to stop Ghazal Dior from acquiring horses for his army, and this is a task that the merchant was made for. If you stopped him, well then you've got good horses, so go ahead and recover 1 stamina. Or 2 if you're a halfling. But if you fail at this one, then you've got the Farizon military mad at you, so you get a penalty for your next task. Option 2 was to join the Farizon army as a mercenary. In this timeline where Ghazal Dior is ruling, he doesn't care for anyone except the humans, so everyone else is at a penalty. You get bonuses if you've successfully done any task that takes you to Endarnum, and if you've beaten the pirates at Stratium. But if you've prevented the military from getting horses, they're going to remember you. And joining is nearly impossible then. Number 3 was to meet Ramili Nefarin in the Ramzas grasslands. That would be the elf that rides the unicorn. And if you chose this one, then you are following the plot of the story. So you get a lot of points for doing this, plus some stamina recovery, because that's what happens when adventurers meet mysterious elves in the wild. There's lots of bonuses on this one if you've completed tasks that were likely to bring you into contact with her. She's a friendly person, just a bit elusive, so if you fail at this one, you're not losing anything. Task 4 was to find out why Ramili Nefarin wouldn't leave the grasslands, and this task is harder, but it's also part of the story's plot, so there's a big reward for succeeding here. Option 5 was to investigate the demonic presence in Endarnum, and the bonuses and penalties are fairly similar to the previous trips you could make, although this time, if you attempted to investigate Endarnum before but failed, you still get a small bonus because you know the area, and if you succeeded at that task, then you get a large bonus. The 6th possible task was to enter the Shimmering Zone, and it's fairly easy to do. If you've successfully investigated Marl McMarl in this chapter, which is task 9, then that incurs a huge penalty on doing this. If you successfully enter the Shimmering Zone, then you are dead. What were you expecting? You were told you couldn't go in. Your character went off and had some kind of Southern Reach trilogy happen to them. Option 7 was to find information about Queen Lemera Lennon. And once more, getting to know the elves in general is a big bonus for this one. Since she lives at the end of the world, and the information about her is going to be centuries out of date, it's a bit harder to get the details on this one. Option 8 is one of the most unfair choices in the entire game, since it's to go meet Queen Lemera Lennon, and at the time that you're offered this choice, you don't know that only elves can meet her. On top of that, according to the Game Master's notes, most players who tried to meet her ran out of stamina, and so if you fail at this task, set your stamina to 0. That means you will have to take a rest with your next action, regardless of what it was. And finally, option 9 for you was to investigate Marl McMarl. He's a bit elusive, but it's not like he's hiding from you. If you manage to track him down, then you get a decent number of points, plus a pretty big bonus to the next task that you do that isn't entering the Shimmering. So if you chose to do that next, hold on to the bonus for the next time. On the other hand, if you failed to find anything on Marl, well then you're running into some interference that's going to carry over to your next task. Once more, here are all of the resolution cards. And now it's time for Chapter 5. We're in the timeline for King Ghazal Dior here. And before we get to the characters that people sent in, the storyteller in the wraparound segment gives us a bit of backstory on Ramili Nefarin and why she rides around the plains on a unicorn. She was one of 3 sisters who all fell in love with humans, and the Ramzas grasslands are where her human lover died. In the city of Ramzas, We catch up with the dwarven fighter George Escar, who once more went to Endarnum, and once more took a bunch of innocent goblins prisoner. As George Escar is really coming across as a jerk. He chats with Firos Ratos, and they talk about how a merchant stopped Ghazal Dior from getting his horses, but the king is still trying. Also, Marl has been going around the world and bringing people to Faronome, capital of Farizon, where Ghazal Dior rules. In Faronome, Marl meets with the great sage Magnus and asks him to remove the spells that causes the dragons to attack anyone who crosses the water near Farizon. Magnus asks if the miracle will occur, and Marl says that the signs are pointing to it already happening. A mercenary army is growing in Faronome, and they're not getting along well with the native population. Violence is happening in the streets. But Ghazal Dior now has his army, and after reviewing the troops, is going to march out and attack Endarnum. Marl meets with the team he's gathered, the dwarven warriors Locane and Freylich, the priestess Iris, and the wizard Phyllis, and he wants to use their help to confront the king during the review of the troops. Marl mentions that it's important that they don't stir up the mercenaries too much, because if they revolt, they could kill Ghazal Dior. The team infiltrates the palace, and Iris breaks away from the rest of the group to talk to Ghazal Dior herself. She tells the king that the god Duel the Black is using him, and that he needs to abdicate before things get worse. Ghazal Dior isn't having any of that, though. As the army parades past the king, Marl jumps up to the review stand and talks to Ghazal Dior. Marl is there to steal Lara Ranan's tear, and Ghazal Dior reveals that he's wearing it around his neck. Marl then says he'll get the tear later, and makes his escape. Finally, the army of Farizon marches out of the city and heads towards Endarnum. And that means it's decision time. A few of the decisions this time are mutually exclusive, so keep that in mind. Your options this time are, number 1, trust Marl McMarl and fight alongside him. Number 2, don't trust Marl McMarl and stop him. Number 3, meet with King Ghazal Dior and try to get him to stop. Number 4, you could always steal Lara Ranan's tear yourself before Marl gets his hands on it. Number 5, you could try to kill Ghazal Dior. Number 6, you can try to get the Farizon military to revolt. Number 7, go to Endarnum yourself and hopefully head off the Farizon army. Number 8, you can infiltrate Endarnum and interfere with whatever the demons are doing there. And number 9, you could try to find a different Lara Ranan's tear. Don't forget that resting is an option, and then write down the 3 things that you're going to do in Chapter 5. This is the last decision point for the King Ghazal Dior timeline, and we're approaching an ending. Now it's time for the Chapter 4 results. And this time the outcomes can be a bit complicated. The first few are ones that we've already seen. Option 1, enter the Shimmering Zone. Well, you found out last chapter that doing that was a bad idea. If you found Marl McMarl in Chapter 2, then he probably told you to stay away from it. But if you did manage to enter the Shimmering Zone, then you're dead, game over. Your character is probably getting consumed by some unspeakable evil that dwells between worlds. That snake-like cloud is still out there, though if you choose to investigate it in this chapter, the bonus is a bit smaller. Option 3 was to go learn about Lara Ranan's tears from Ramili Nafarin. And, yeah, all of the elven names in this game are just horrible. Again, you'll have to work to get her to open up, but there's a few more things that you'll get bonuses from this time. Option 4 was to visit Queen Lamera Lennon in her ice palace. This hard task is even harder this time, though at least if you made the decision in Chapter 4, you knew that this was only really possible if you were playing an elf. And then we get to the 6 options for searching for Ghazal Dior. He's only in one of the locations, and if you successfully find him, then that will end the chapter. Every location you search increases the chances that you'll succeed at the next one. Most of these tasks aren't too hard, except for the ones where entrance is restricted. Option 5 was to search for Ghazal Dior in Ramzas. He's not there. Option 6 was to search for him in Nahan. He's also not there. Option 7 was to search for Ghazal Dior in the Great Forest of Elda, and that's where he's located at. You get an additional bonus if you've been to Faranom, because there's information there that points to him. And if you did this task first or second, don't overlook that you get bonus points for succeeding early. Option 8 is to search for Ghazal Dior in the Demon Kingdom of Dura, and this is the only one of these that has a penalty for failure, since you're sneaking into Mordor. If you fail, then you've been captured, and you don't do your next task this chapter. Just scratch it out. And remember, if you've run out of stamina at this point, and this was your first action, then your third action becomes a rest regardless of what it was. Option 9 was to search for Ghazal Dior in his home city of Faranom, capital city of Horizon. If you succeed at this task, and you have remaining tasks this chapter, then you can change your next task to search the Great Forest. So here's all of those action resolution cards for you one more time. And with that, it's time for the final chapter with a decision. We're back in the timeline where the throne of Horizon is empty, and on the border between the Goblin Kingdom of Dura and the Dwarven Empire, the human warriors Adol Kristin, Exatros, and Olbari get into a fight with some random people because they think they know something about Ghazal Dior. Then Marl appears from nowhere to tell them that Ghazal Dior isn't there, and instead he's in Erda. Events like this are happening all over the world, as Marl is directing people hunting for Ghazal Dior to the Great Forest. A group of 7 elves arrive in Indaldium, the capital of the Elven Kingdom, but even though it's a kingdom, it's a democracy, or maybe a geriocracy, since the only people they're allowed to vote for are the oldest elves. Anyway, this group of elves goes to meet the 7 ancients that rule the kingdom, and the ancients have a magic sphere that shows Ghazal Dior walking through the forest with a halfling. Ghazal Dior has been marked as a friend of the elves due to a previous visit before the whole rebellion started. This Ghazal Dior rejected Dul's plan to give him the throne and start a new war to unite men and elves. But during the battle with his father, Ghazal Dior was blinded. He's being guided to the Elven Kingdom by a halfling priest, Pippin Sereni. And Pippin found Ghazal Dior by following the cloud. Ghazal Dior could see the continent-spanning cloud in his mind, and was following it himself. As Ghazal Dior enters the elven capital, Marl suddenly appears to explain the plot. The split timeline was caused by Dul, who was using Lauraranan's tears to try to influence events. Since Ghazal Dior possesses one of the tears, he can fix this. Then Marl explains what the tears are. An elf named Laura Ranan fell in love with a man called Manir Mananiel of Rodan. Circumstances forced them apart, and Laura Ranan hid away in a cave. She stayed there crying for 3 years, until her sister Ramiri Nefarin searched for her. She found that Laura Ranan's body had become crystal, and then for some reason turned it over to the greatest dwarven gemsmith, Gimlo Donres, that's the immortal dwarf, to turn her body into magic jewelry. And those 7 pieces are Laura Ranan's tears. One of these pieces of jewelry was given to Queen Lamera Lennon because she was Laura Ranan's best friend. But Limera Lennon was also Ramiri Nafarin's sister, so that means that Limera Lennon was also Lararanon's sister. And Ramiri Nafarin also fell in love with a human man in the same area. It's like all of this was written to maximize the confusion. Anyways, moving on. Limera Lennon gave her tear to her child, Ghazal Dior, and that's why he has it. That particular tier holds a prayer that can restore that which has been sundered, so it's the one that can fix the world. Marl wraps up his exposition by saying that the holder of the crystal must now go to the destined location and tells Pippin to guide Ghazal Dior there. And this final decision is laid out a bit differently. The first 4 options are where you think the crystal should go. Only pick one of these. In the magazine, anyone who picked out more than one only got their first choice. The remaining 5 options are what you're trying to do. Succeeding at any of these will end the game, so even though you have 3 choices for this chapter, you'll probably just want to pick a rest, then a destination, and then a goal. Your choices for destination are number 1, Pharanome, capital of Horizon, and Ghazal Dior's hometown. Number 2, Endarnum, the ruined city ruled by demons. Number 3, Mount Pedra, which lies at the end of the King's Road. Or number 4, Gusladon, which is the capital of the Goblin Kingdom. And the 5 things that your character can try to do once they get there are number 5, stop Marl from completing his task. Number 6, steal the tier for yourself. Number 7, kill Ghazal Dior. Number 8, you can attempt to aid Marl. Or number 9, you can just watch what happens. Lock in your decisions now, and then we'll start finding out how this story ends. First up, we have to resolve Chapter 5 decisions. This is the timeline where Ghazal Dior is the bad king. Option 1 was to trust Marl McMarl and fight alongside him. And obviously, this was the good selection. It's also one of the easier tasks. Option 2 was to not trust Marl McMarl and try to stop him. You get a big bonus if you've managed to already interfere with him on another task. Option 3 was to try to convince Ghazal Dior to stop. Characters with a class that's good at convincing people got a bonus for this task. And if you succeed, that ends the plot in the Bad King timeline. So you'll get some extra bonus points if this was your first or second action. And if it succeeds, well, then you don't take any more actions at all this time. Option 4 was to steal Laura Ranen's tier for yourself, and stealing something from around a king's neck is awfully tricky, unless they're already dead. If you fail this one, then you wind up locked up in the dungeon, so you'll have to take some time to escape there. The 5th option was regicide. Try to kill King Ghazal Dior. The people who got a bonus for this one are either good at fighting, or maybe making his balcony collapse. According to the notes on this chapter, the only people who succeeded were ones that incited revolt in the Horizon army first, though going to Endarnum could also have provided an advantage. And if the king is dead, well, there's nothing else to do, the story's over. Inciting the Horizon military to revolt isn't that hard, they're already disgruntled, and it'll help you if you previously joined them. Option 7 was to go to Endarnum to try to stop the Horizon army. I'm not even sure what form that takes, since nobody succeeded at it in the actual game. Similarly, Option 8 is to infiltrate Endarnum and stop the demon's plans. What those plans were is never mentioned in the story, so presumably they were just going to fight. Finally, Option 9 was to seek out a different Lara Ranon's tier, and this is a very difficult task because it's essentially doing a whole nother quest. You don't get many points for this one because it's not relevant to the story at all. If you did choose to do it, well then you're out of the story. No more tasks for this chapter. And there you go. And here's all of those resolution cards once more. And now we find out what happened to King Ghazal Dior. Because he failed to acquire decent horses, the army's march on Indarnum has been slowed. The rest of the world is watching, unwilling to become involved in the battle. But the dwarf fighter Zaki Tramana, goblin Poltak Dominig, and elfin wizard Meshua Rua Ureo managed to convince the city of Ramzas to send their forces out. In the Horizon army, military commander Grom Dead believes that Mara will take care of things, so he isn't willing to do anything. But then he's killed by his lieutenant Dondo as the start of a mutiny. The elves Phesis Mare and Mirfan try to warn King Ghazal Dior, but while they're talking, a goblin named Di Basel cuts through the back of the tent and stabs Ghazal Dior. As the king dies, a halfling fighter named Wahab arrives and kills Di Basel for his act. That's when Marl McMarl finally shows up, and the dying King Ghazal Dior says that he just wanted to bring people together. Marl admonishes all of the people there and says that it didn't have to end this way, even though all of the people there were actively working against it ending that way. Then Marl reveals his true identity. He's actually the god Zari the Purple, and he lets the group there know that everyone who was involved in this story will be remembered in crystal. And that's it. That's the results of the King Ghazal Dior timeline. The ultimate fate of the king was decided by how many people succeeded in assassination versus how many people succeeded in convincing him to stop. More points were earned in the assassination, and so that's how things turned out. That's the end of one timeline, but what happened in the other? Well, first, we have to resolve the Chapter 6 decisions. And given the narrow scope here, these will go pretty quick. The correct destination to go to was Mount Pedra. If you chose anything else, then you went there and nothing was happening, and the story's over. You might be thinking to yourself, wasn't this decision the first time that Mount Pedra came up in this story at all? And yes it was. One thing that might save you is that if you've successfully investigated that long cloud that crossed the continent, then you know that it leads to Mount Greya, and you headed there. If you made it to Mount Greya, then these were the things that you could do there. Number 5 was stopping Marl from taking any actions. This one's very difficult to succeed at, but if you manage to, you get a handful of points, and then you destroyed the world, so good job. You can try to steal the tier for yourself, in which case you take it away from the place that it needs to be, and away from the people who need to have it, and the world ends shortly after that. Hope those 10 points were worth it. Option 7 was to kill Ghazal Dior because you don't like his face or something. And this is pretty easy because he's a blind guy. You could push him in front of a cart or something. Of course, if you do this, the world ends, so probably not a good idea. If you want to assist Marl, well, he already knows what he's doing and has everything he needs, so your help doesn't add much. But if you succeed, maybe you brought someone a glass of water or something when they wanted it. Get some points for that. The correct answer, per the story, is that you don't do anything. You just show up and watch what happens. And thus, if you showed up at the correct place, you can't even fail this task. You just get some free points for witnessing the end of the story. Here's all of the result cards to help you fill out your final points. And now, here's the conclusion of The Lord of the Crystal. Pippin is leading Ghazal Dior to Mount Greya, and Ghazal reveals that it's not really the destination that matters, but the time that he arrives. He has to rejoin with the soul of his counterpart in the other world. At the end of the King's Road, an enormous crowd is waiting for them. An impromptu festival takes place, with about half the players in the game getting name-dropped. In the morning, Gazaldior and Marl take the tear, it flies up into the air, and everything is fixed. And if you were wondering what Rudolfarn's miracle is, well, the storyteller from all of the wraparound texts lets us know that knowledge of the story itself is the miracle. The end. And that's the game, The Lord of the Crystal. And with all of that done, yeah, it wasn't a very well thought out game. I did my best to patch over some of the problems, but as the story progressed, you could tell that there were some very obvious best choices for race, class, and god to worship. Dwarves barely had anything to justify their involvement past being around for that first chapter. Halflings weren't even there at all until it seems like they suddenly went, better give Gazaldior a halfling companion so they do something. It was hard to justify the involvement of craftsmen in any of the tasks, and you can certainly see that represented in the scorecards, where only a very narrow range of combinations showed up in the top 50. You often didn't have enough information to even make a reasonable guess at what tasks you should do, and resolving everything with no player character involvement is always the worst way to end a role-playing module. Lord of the Crystal was a bad game, and I recognize the cruelty of saying that at the end of this long video where I guided you through playing it. My intention here was to try to recapture the experience of playing the game originally, and a large part of that was the game just not being fair. And despite all of the obvious problems with it, The Lord of the Crystal got a sequel. It was published in Marukatsu PC Engine throughout 1990. I strongly doubt that I'd adapt that one for a video. This was enough work. Even though I couldn't make this exactly the same as the original Lord of the Crystal, I think I did a good job of capturing the spirit of it. This type of magazine game is long gone, and we won't see it again. So regardless of anything else about the quality of Lord of the Crystal, I'm pleased that I was able to share it with you.